أصحاب المعالي والسعادة السيدات والسادة الحضور السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Your Excellencies and distinguished guests, it is now my honor to welcome you to our first panel session of BX 2025 on the topic of adoption versus adaptation. What kind of evidence about behavioral science do policymakers need? Over the next 45 minutes, our panelists will discuss what evidence policymakers need about human behavior in order to be confident that their policies will actually work. After all, evidence shows that context plays a big role in influencing behavior, and the various groups that can show different responses to the same policy. To account for this, what we might need is better data, and of course, repeated testing. But how does that ring in the ears of policymakers when seemingly one trial or pilot can give a clear result? When can we be confident that a policy will successfully scale? To lead this discussion, we have the brilliant Elisabeth Costa, who is Chief of Innovation and Partnerships at Behavioral Insights Team, also known as BIT, co-hosts of BX 2025. And the panel she will chair is equally brilliant and consists of Dr. Chiara Varazzani, lead behavioral scientist at the OECD, which disseminates best practice in behavioral science across its 38 member countries, key partners, and beyond. Joined by Professor Dilip Soman, who is the leading expert in behavioral science and its applications to business and public policy. Besides his role as Canada Research Chair, Professor Soman serves as a director of the Behavioral Economics in Action Research Center at the Rotman School of Management in the University of Toronto. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists to the stage. In addition to Professor Sunstein, one of the founders of behavioral science, co-author of Nudge, and Robert Walmsley, professor at Harvard Law School, and of course, last but not least, Professor David Halpern, who is President Emeritus and founding director of the Behavioral Insights Team, the world's first government unit dedicated to applying insights from behavioral economics to government policy. Liz, I will hand over to you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Well, look, it is fantastic to be at BX, and it is particularly fantastic to be here in Abu Dhabi, celebrating the vibrancy of behavioral science in the region. So welcome to this first plenary, where we're going to be discussing adoption and adaptation. In keeping with the spirit of the name of the session, we're going to have a slightly fluid approach, and we'll have some of the panelists coming and going during the session. But to kick us off, behavioral science has long been tied to an investigation of what works. We, as a field, have really sought to identify interventions that reliably shift behavior. And crucially, we've also sought to identify and quantify the extent of those shifts. And so in many ways, the success of the field has really been rooted in this rigorous and empirical approach. We together have demonstrated that behavioral insights can have a positive impact on everything from tax collection to vaccination uptake. But one of really the trickiest challenges that we face as a field is working out the extent to which, if we find that something works in one place or one context, how much do we expect it to work in another place or another context? And that is what we are going to investigate here on this panel today. And we're going to kick off with some very practical questions. We're going to be looking at when should we adopt behavioral interventions based on existing evidence, and when and how should we adapt them to new contexts. And I'm really delighted to have such an expert panel here today to discuss and debate these questions. And we're going to take you on a bit of a journey from how behavioral insights and the What Works agenda became entwined, through to how our conception of what works has evolved as we've tried to apply generalizable insights to different cultures and contexts. And then we're going to talk about really what that means for us as behavioral practitioners and policymakers. When and how should we be judging when to adopt and when to adapt? So with that, we're going to kick off, and I'm going to ask David to start us off. So David, it wasn't inevitable that the What Works agenda and behavioral science would develop in parallel. Can you briefly talk us through how it evolved?
Of course, Liz, and I realise that in spirit of the BX, Cass and I may have to go for another meeting with the policy senior figures, you know. So for those who don't know the kind of history, when we'd of course been looking very closely at what Cass had been doing in the White House, but we decided to take a very empirical approach, we don't know if this is going to work at all in the UK. We did that both for methodological reasons, but also actually for almost rhetorical reasons, which is the sense that we were dealing with a very skeptical audience of policymakers, and a really effectively said, well, let's see if it does work with you, let's run experiments and so on. So we took this very deliberately empirical perspective, and honestly, we weren't sure what would work or what didn't. As it happens, it turned out a lot of things worked remarkably well, and indeed, as others will speak about this event, the arc of that since has been that the replication in many other places too. But even if you didn't care about behavioral science, one of the points was empiricism, that kind of testing, experimentation, we should use it everywhere. And so therefore, with support from other senior political figures, now then CAPSEC, we also set up the What Works Centers of Movements, and as you know, I ended up being National What Works Advisor for a decade alongside it. And so we started with one What Works Center, we built 14. So why not try and, this is fantastic, why don't we apply empiricism everywhere? And I often think that the dirty truth of a lot of government is that we are spending trillions of dollars on things, and we don't, in our heart, know whether these things work or don't, and is there a better variation? This is a really profound thing. I'll just make one last remark, if I might, which is that I think there is this deeper continuing connection, which is not just an empirical one, which has characterized a lot of behavioral science, but that it's also one of the lessons of behavioral science, as Cass was just talking about, is essentially humans are overconfident, be it about sense of humor or driving, but about everything else. Often those the illusion of explanatory depth, and even the brightest amongst us are subject to it, the most brilliant policymakers. We've been doing this thing for years in education or whatever. We kind of think it must be working. Well, why? Right, and so it goes to the heart of this issue of overconfidence, and we've even run some experiments on it. One of my favorite we did a couple of years ago is that we have this expression, of course, in English, I know it like the back of my hand. I'm so confident, I just know it like the back of my hand. So, well, do people know the back of their hand? So, of course, we ran an experiment. People come in and we cover their hands and we say, do you think you can recognize the back of your hand? And of course, everyone says, of course I can, particularly men. Can they? Not really. Wonderful. I said men are particularly bad. They're really terribly calibrated, in case you didn't know. But it's a really profound point. So the next time someone says, I know it, I really know it, I know it works, or I know it like the back of my hand, you're like, that is more true than you realize. In other words, you're probably overconfident, you probably don't know it. So I think there's this fundamental connection which is operating on two levels. And the final much is, I think one of the things I wrote this report last year on the global evidence with a colleague, Dylan Maru, which is that we should collaborate on the sharing of evidence. We should definitely do it around behavioral issues, but in fact, we should do it more generally. Right? That was a fundamental thing I hope will come from us working together.
And do you want to just say one more minute on the global evidence work and how you're building that infrastructure for us to collaborate on what works and why around the world?
Sure, so I'm delighted. I'm really pleased. There's a number of funders who've come behind putting significant resources into what are called living evidence reports. Alongside it, also trying to enhance the collaboration of governments to share and publish their results and put them together. So that's essentially the objective. So that if you're a policymaker in any given area, rather than governments separately saying, well, I wonder what's the best way of reducing crime or increasing community cohesion, why can't we have a go-to set of sources which we collaborate about? And I think, again, we'll look back and just think that's madness. And the other thing it'll throw up is that, as we see in many of the What Works centers, it'll show us that our evidence base in many areas is much thinner than we thought it was. Well, then let's do something about it once we can see what we don't know, right? To embrace that, what I think, a combination of daring and humility.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. We're going to come to Dilip in a minute to talk about your work on scaling and the importance of culture and context. But before we do, Cass, we know we can't test everything everywhere. We don't have the resources to do that, but we also often don't have the political appetite to do that. Can you give some reflections on what do you think are the generalizable insights about human behavior that hold pretty well across different cultures, countries, contexts? And therefore, for us as practitioners and policymakers, there are some things that we should just crack on and do.
Okay, so it's clear that everywhere in the world, dropped objects will fall. So there's gravity everywhere. I think it's clear that if any human being eats a rock, it's not going to go well.
Yep.
It's clear that if there's suffering visible, people are going to feel sad. So there are generalizable things about humanity that are known. The idea that if you simplify access to something, there will be increased use of that thing. There might be a country where that's not true, but I don't want to visit that country. That would be a very incomprehensible country. The idea that if you give information in a way that attracts attention, suppose you're concerned about food waste or about obesity, that would matter. That will be true everywhere. Now, it might be that there are cultures where something, in the opening remarks I found extremely instructive and completely accurate there. There might be things that connect with people's identity. So in India, there was an effort to do something involving sanitation, and they emphasized Gandhi. Gandhi was very concerned about that, and so there was a connection drawn with the cultural heritage. That quite worked. In Texas, one of the states, there was an environmental effort, and Texas is very strong, and you know, the idea of environmental things, that's not maybe the first that would come to mind. So what they did, they had a campaign, a nudge called Don't Mess with Texas. Don't Mess with Texas, which connected with the culture. So to think of those things is very important, at least in domains where it's not like eating a rock or dropping an object. But in many domains, the behavioral findings are very solid, and we have to test them, but we can be highly confident that they'll probably work.
Great, thank you. So, Dilip, I think one of the tensions that we face when we're talking about what works in behavioral science is the temptation to see what works as a question that we can definitively answer. And a lot of your work, and particularly your recent book, What Works, What Doesn't, and When, you talk about the importance of adaptation and context and scalability. And I think this beautiful phrase of the behavioral scientist as a cartographer navigating diverse policy landscapes. Can you talk us through, for all of us in the room, what that means in practice?
The context question, yes. So I've been thinking about this for many, many years. I remember when I was in Ottawa spending some time at the government, we'd done a session like this on evidence-based policy, and then at the end, one person put up their hand and said, is there any evidence to show that evidence-based policy is better than non-evidence? It was a great question, and it got me thinking about when evidence matters and when it doesn't, right? And so I go back to the example that Cass gave about dropping objects and those objects falling everywhere in the world. Now, we know they'll fall on Earth, but if I was doing the same experiment on the moon, for example, that object would perhaps float away. And the idea is that for every science, there is a broader context in which you can make predictions definitively. In our science, those context brackets are incredibly small, right? So for example, if I was dropping this piece of paper, it doesn't matter what color the piece of paper is or how heavy it is. It's going to fall, right? But for behavioral phenomena, all of these things matter. So Richard Thaler wrote a beautiful book called Misbehaving. And in Misbehaving, he introduced these animals called SIFs. So what's a SIF? It's a supposedly irrelevant factor. Things that we think shouldn't matter, but they do. And as you rightly said, at the beginning, everything that was non-economic was considered a SIF, and then we started recognizing framing and mental accounting as part of what matters, but then other SIFs come along. And the thing about SIFs is, they're often, you can't predict them. It's often after the fact that you try something and it doesn't work, and you're, that's because people were different, or that's because the situation was different. And so the chance that you've collected evidence in one particular set of SIFs, and that you're going to apply that evidence to another set of SIFs that are exactly identical is incredibly low, right? And so the scientist in me says, well, you can never get perfect evidence, right? Despite the fact that there are a lot of things that we can say with some degree of certainty. So the way I think about this is the whole cartography idea is the idea that if you can imagine multiple dimensions of context and you run the same experiment across those different dimensions of context, you get a landscape. Tall mountains effects are very strong, deep valleys effects are very weak. And in geography, they use a term called relief to describe how rocky that landscape is. If the relief is high, you've got lots of tall mountains and lots of deep valleys. If the relief is low, it's roughly uniform, right? And so one of the things that we need to do better as academics is to start working on quantifying what the relief of our phenomena is. We don't do that, right? And that's part of the academic production function. We are not incentivized to do that. Lots of issues there. But if we can start a program of research where we take all of our classic findings and say, well, that's a high relief finding, which means you need to test more. If it's a low relief finding, then the burden on testing is lower. So that's the idea of the behavioral scientist as a cartographer. One last thing, and then I'll move on, is what do we actually mean by evidence? And for years and years, we've sort of gone around making the point that unless you have a randomized controlled trial, it's not good evidence. And I do want to say that I think if we have a low relief phenomena, which is fairly robust, I don't think you need to do a randomized controlled trial. If it's a high relief phenomena, we're not quite sure that the context maps onto the original situation in which the data were collected, that's when you probably need something like an RCT. But also there's a lot of new techniques now. Machine learning is offering a whole bunch, synthetic control. And so I think we now have good alternatives to RCT. So we do need to think about broader sets of evidence bases.
And I just want to draw you all on that point, actually, because in the introduction, I talked about RCTs being part of the basis for the foundations of the field and demonstrating the efficacy of behavioral science. But as the field's developed over time, one of the limitations of RCTs is that they don't tell us very much about why things work, just that they do. You've talked a bit about some of the different methods we're now using in the field. Can I draw each of you, maybe starting with David, on how do you think we really get at that question of why does something work, or why does it not work? And how do we design studies that really help us hone in on that question?
Yeah, I mean, by the way, in defense of, I think, well-constructed RCTs can be really precise often. One of the great advantages is they enable you to isolate a sort of etiological factor, but they're definitely not the only forces. We should be good Bayesians and use multiple forms of evidence. One of the most useful things I think that happens in our field, which people should embrace as a good thing, is when you don't get a reproduction. When the paper doesn't fall, like, well, what the hell happened there? It tells you something, you've changed something, maybe a cultural context or some other factor, and it's telling something very, very important about causality. So when people think, oh my goodness, it didn't reproduce, actually that's a very exciting moment when it's telling you something else is going on. So we should embrace it, right? You shouldn't be defeated by it.
If I could just jump in on that. That's why we call the book What Works, What Doesn't, and When. Because oftentimes we document what works, but we don't document what didn't work. And I think, to your point, there's a lot to be learned from what didn't work.
So 2 ideas. Suppose you have a problem in a country where people are suffering, and you want to reduce the suffering. You might think there are 6 things that are relatively inexpensive we can try, and it's so urgent to reduce the suffering that we're going to try all 6. And then if things are much better after 6 months or a year, we'll keep doing the 6. I think that's an honorable approach. And in some countries faced with a problem, and you can take your pick, that's what's done. And it's not scientifically perfect because you don't know what caused it to get better, but it's humanly, what's the right word? Great, because people are doing better. Here's another idea, and this is something that some governments are very keen on. Conducting a randomized controlled trial, it's time consuming, it takes a lot of capacity. So instead what we're going to do with respect to, let's say, health or safety, we're going to do, starting in July of 2025, this. And then we'll see by, let's say, December of 2025 whether it's better. And often it turns out it is better. There are fewer people who were subject to whatever problem. And that's something that's thrilling. Now, it's correct to say it might be there was something else that happened between July and December, so the intervention wasn't the cause, but that's maybe a little too academic. If things got a lot better, you might have a high degree of confidence, and then you can keep trying it. So before and after interventions, I think, are underrated. Am I going to be fired from my job because I said that? Not yet.
Fantastic. Chiara, I'd love to come to you and zoom out, because the OECD has a unique bird's eye view of what's happening across multiple countries. What have you seen work well across OECD countries in terms of how they're grappling with this question of whether to adopt existing evidence or adapt to different cultural contexts?
Thank you so much, Liz. And good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. And so 5 years ago at the OECD, we launched BRAIN, the BRAIN Initiative, which is the Behavioral Research in Action international network that brings together over 200 government officials from 55 governments around the world. And really, this is a great space to discuss questions like the questions of this panel. And so we like to discuss things such as how do we adapt what works in one country to another country. And I just wanted to share with you 3 lessons learned that we've seen playing out over the years. So first of all, use fit-for-purpose evidence. And it's something that we discussed already in the panel, but we really saw that countries that do succeed don't fall into the trap of ideology. What does it mean? It means that very often they move beyond a very rigid evidence hierarchy that puts randomized controlled trials at the very top, because you need much more flexibility. Policy making, we know it's very messy. And so really, what you need is to be flexible and to adapt your methodology. And so that's why we teamed up with ETH Zurich and Effective Advisory to publish 7 Routes to Experimentation, which is a map to help policymakers pick the right method depending on the policy at stake. So it could be an RCT, it could be a before and after comparison, as Cass was saying, an A/B testing, or also sometimes a qualitative study. And really the key idea is to have usable and fit-for-purpose evidence instead of always reaching the gold standards. And I think we saw this very vividly during COVID. At that time, you had ministers rushing through doors in behavioral science team because they really needed answers really fast. They needed answers about masks, about vaccines, about travel bans. And you really didn't have any time to run RCTs. And you had 2 options. Either you just froze and you wait for the perfect opportunity to run your perfect study. You try, right? So you try your best, and knowing that if you didn't, decisions would have made based on gut feeling. And so really 7 Routes try to help navigate these realities. The second lesson I wanted to share with you is that it's important to test across borders. This is something that has not been discussed in the panel yet, but I think it's very important. So we saw that governments that do succeed do not adapt only internally, but they actually adapt evidence as well internationally. So they collaborate internationally to stress test ideas across borders. And this panel highlighted that the same intervention that worked really well, let's say, in Buenos Aires, when you bring it here, it can actually backfire in Abu Dhabi. And if you want to do things properly, the best way to test what works across countries is actually to run coordinated mega studies with other governments. So what does it mean? It means you test the same intervention at the same time, but on different people, in coordination with multiple governments. And this is incredible. It's difficult, but it's incredibly powerful. And so to stress test this, a few years back, we ran a cross-border misinformation experiment with the governments of Canada and France. It worked really well. We cut misinformation sharing by 21% in Canada. And it wasn't a super mega studies, but it showed that really cross-country collaboration can be very powerful to scale evidence. So really, I think that we need much more of mega studies going forward. Third lesson learned, it's important to integrate behavioral science into the machinery of government. So we know that successful behavioral science teams move beyond just small pilots and trials. They really embed behavioral science into the machinery of government, to how governments works. And so at the OECD, we are often asked things like, can you help me set up a behavioral insights team in a new country, in a new minister? And how can we learn from others who did this in the past? But here again, even the governance of behavioral science team is not like IKEA furniture. It's not something that you can just open the box and expect this to work the same everywhere. And that's why at the OECD, we also help countries not only bringing evidence, but bringing best practices on how to build a behavioral science team. And that's why we built Logic, which is a framework around 5 main things. So leadership, objectives, governance, integration, and capability. And we see many good examples around the world from countries who are really doing this well. So really trying to use behavioral science as routine in policy design. So I had these 3 lessons learned. I just maybe also want to share a reflection, building on what Cass and David and Dilip were saying about adoption and adaptation. I think that we made a lot of progress. Even looking at our last BX, which was 5 years ago, we've seen there's so much more evidence, and we are sharing much more evidence. So coming back to David's point, many trials are now shared across the world. But I wonder if our field of applied behavioral science is at an inflection point. We've built a lot of evidence, and we run thousands of trials. But at the end of the day, if you really want to tackle the adoption versus adaptation questions, don't we also need to focus a little bit more on theories and predictive models? Mm-hmm. Because we talk about physics quite a lot in this panel with Cass. And I have the impression that without stronger theories in applied behavioral science, we're a little bit flying blind every time we have to go back and do this trial and error. Imagine, building a bridge without physics, without some very simple laws from Newtonian physics. That's very hard. And that's a little bit how applied behavioral science feels like. It feels like, building things without hanging by theory. And so just wanted to share an invitation to all of us. I know that plenty of academics are working on great theories, but I would like us to work together, to come together, to think more about what are these general insights and theories that can explain a lot of the evidence that we saw. Really trying to move from asking the questions of what works to the question of predicting what will likely work here. So in short, these 3 lessons learned: use fit-for-purpose evidence, test across borders, integrate behavioral science into governments, and finally, invest more in stronger predictive models.
Thank you. And I love that last reflection, because I also think a positive change from the last BX is that we are a lot more focused on our theories of change and considering when we're motivating an intervention, why do we think it's going to work and why do we think it's going to work in a particular context. We still have a few minutes, so I want to pick up one of the points you made, Chiara, about mega studies and collaborations across borders. We have an incredible group of people here from all around the world. What do you think are the topics on which we should be collaborating and building the next set of mega studies?
Okay.
So before
Dilip.
I respond to that,
Yes.
I do want to say that this was the first time anyone has compared behavioral science to IKEA furniture. So thank you for that. I'm going to use it sometime. I do want to sort of go back a little bit on the context question and unpack that. I think there's differences across cultures, and we spoke a little bit about that. People are different from each other, we know that. I think it's important for us to realize that people are also different from themselves. And that's a part of the context that we don't think too much about. Me making decisions in the morning is different from me making decisions at the end of the day when I'm tired,
Yep.
weekdays versus weekends, digital versus on paper. And I think that's the part of the context that I don't think gets talked about as much. So again, the distinction is between, are there differences in target population versus are there distinctions in situations, right? And in some of our work, we found that, in fact, the differences that you get in behavior as a function of situation are perhaps larger than the differences you get as a function of target population, right? And so one of the things I would love to see more research on is that question. How important is the situation versus the target population? So that's one thing that I think is helpful to think about. The other thing to think about a little bit is sort of, again, reflecting back on some of the comments that were made is, I think we need to make a distinction between what is similar in terms of the underlying psychology, the why things happen, versus the what happens. And so a quick example of that would be some of the work on how do I encourage people to save for retirement? Well, yeah, you create some empathy with your future self. Now, how you create that empathy and what you use to get that future self to think about might work differently across cultures. So in the United States, for example, the idea is build empathy with your own future self. Think about your future. We tried the same thing in Mexico. And in Mexico, empathizing with your own future self meant that you were taking away from your family's present. It backfired, right? But if you get people to think about their family's future, it still works, right? And so the psychology that's underlying it is the same. How you trigger it, how it manifests, is different. I think we need to keep that distinction.
And also the acceptability of it. So Dilip, one of my favorite studies that you've done is the one you did in India where you separated people's wages into different envelopes and you had the picture. And one of the envelopes was a picture of that person's child. And in order to access the savings, the person had to rip through that face, which was a very powerful intervention. And I tried to get this off the ground with a UK challenger bank. And the idea of putting the photo of somebody's child digitally and ripping it up was not.
Not acceptable.
We didn't get it off the ground.
That's right.
But yes. So coming back to the question of what should we do together?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's lots of behavioral phenomena that I think we need to do a lot more research on. So even things like framing effects or mental accounting kind of stuff, earmarking expenses or earmarking money for future savings. We know it works in general, but we don't know too much about the execution. So like to your point, like should we do it with kids' pictures? Should we do it by empathy with your future self? So that's the kind of stuff that I think would be fascinating to study across cultures, if you will, but also across situations. We could start looking at how products are delivered as a function of situation, right? And so in some research we're doing right now with an insurance company, we're saying, well, look, people come to an insurance company's website to do all kinds of things. They come to browse for products, they come to pay bills, they come to research specific topics. And the way in which you would serve that website optimally for somebody who had these different goals would be different, right? And so now that we have some data on who these people are, but we also have data on are they showing up in the morning versus the evening, are they doing it on the weekday versus the weekend, we can now start serving different products, right? And again, the idea is, can you take information about the individual and marry that with information about the situation to produce the best outcome, right? So I think there's a lot of domains that we can do that.
Chiara, what's on your wish list?
I might answer these questions in a slightly different way. So in a more
in an IKEA
practical way, an IKEA way, if you want. But I think if I understand your question, is also if you think about doing mega studies across governments, for example, what will be a wish list potentially of things that we should really do?
Exactly. Yep.
and I mentioned the study that we did on misinformation, and that to me that was not by chance that we chose that. Misinformation and disinformation is intrinsically a global problem. It's not something that you can look in the context of just one specific country. Information online travels across borders. And so here there's a real incentive and a need for governments to collaborate and really try to make things right. There are other things, more behavioral insights 101, like take tax administration. Well, that would not be my first pick, if I may, in the sense that every country and every jurisdiction can come up with the best possible intervention for that. But there are so many other topics that will be very important to have governments collaborate on. Think about climate change and everything related to climate adaptation as well. These things are things that need collaboration and coordinations amongst countries. But also new challenges that are coming up. For example, how humans change their behavior in the medium and long term in response of the massive use of AI. These are things that, as a global community, we need to get our heads straight and come together and really, at least from what we see from the OECD, the best way to do this is to engage multiple governments. And so having coalition of the willing, trying to collaborate together using good evidence and producing evidence across contexts so that you can see what works and
what
the
doesn't,
difference.
and
what doesn't.
And back to the question of sort of what's something that's going to affect all of us. And I think the single biggest trend is the fact that people are living longer. Everywhere in the world, people are living longer. And so essentially 3 industries jump out. There's the financial services industry. You've got to manage your money differently. That's one area where I think it'd be fascinating to study across countries and collaborations on that. Healthcare, that's changing. The way we think about screenings is changing. The way we think about what is preventive, what is curative is changing. And then finally, since people have a lot more time, entertainment. Travel, tourism, these are all questions that I think are going to affect all of us, and I would love to see collaborations on those 3 dimensions.
Fantastic. Well, hopefully those are some conversation starters as we collaborate and speak to each other over the next 2 days. This is a theme that we're going to continue over the rest of the conference as we talk about the approaches to behavioral science in the region. But I hope what you've taken away from this panel is really a challenge to each of us, that we have these ever more sophisticated ways to understand why things work and when they work and for whom they work. And each of us should be really striving to be ambitious and sophisticated in the way that we're testing behavioral interventions so that we can answer those questions. But also, as Cass said, we can keep some of those insights that hold true and think about what can be done quickly, what can be done at scale. So with that, thank you very much for listening to this plenary, and we hope to connect with many of you over the next 2 days. And thank you very much to my wonderful panelists, Dilip and Chiara, and Cass and David.
Thank you so much for your engaged discussion. We have heard from our esteemed speakers on the importance of testing for behavioral science, embedding behavioral science in the machinery of government, adoption of AI, and of course, collaboration. Please hang along for our next session, which will start in the next 10 minutes. And our next session will explore how changing social norms can unlock the UAE's potential. Thank you.